Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I will be talking about Spring Boot profiles, which is a great way for you to segregate beans and configurations and give it a name, meaning that you can create a name like dev or whatever name you want, and you say, okay, all these beans should only be activated when I choose the dev. And when I choose prod, the bean should be different. Even probably it's a data source that is different. It's the port. Maybe in production, you are not using the Tomcat inside the Spring Boot, but you are deploying to an existing web server and you want the configurations to be different. So the code, it's almost the same, but the configuration change. Or you want to go further and say, okay, some of the beans only exist in production. For instance, imagine that you are in a bank and you want to connect to message queues and things like that, that only exist in production because you don't have them on the dev environment, but you want to test your application, right? So you want to create mocked beans and you want your application work as expected in development. Of course, it will simulate sending messages and things like that. But when you switch to production, you want to change the profile. You want to give it another name. And that's what you can do. By the way, this is not constrained to dev, test, the product. You can give the name you want and you can choose the configurations and bean as are better for your development. But let's see the details about this. By the way, usually my presentations, I have a set of slides where I explain in detail the theory, the why, use cases. I give examples, diagrams, things like that. But I always provide at the end a code walkthrough where you see a real application applying the concepts that I'm teaching. So if you are one of the persons that, okay, I just want to see the practice, you can go to the timestamp I usually put on the description of the videos and you can jump directly to the practice and you see how it works. And then later, maybe you want to check the slides and learn more about all the details. Maybe you need to understand yourself, or maybe you want a base to explain to your team in your company or do a presentation, or you just want to know more about it. That's how it works. All the code that I always produce in these videos, at least for Spring Boot, they are available on the GitHub and you can see the address on the posts section of the channel. So let's start with the Spring Boot profiles. So what are profiles in Spring Boot? They are a way to segregate sets of configurations and components or beans in your application and you give them a name. It's like you have a group of things and say, I will call this group dev. And I will call these beans the database, or I will call this set of beans the cloud because they are related with the cloud. And sometimes you want to activate one or the other, or maybe you want to activate 2 or 3 at a time, which is also possible. Or you can even go further and say, okay, I want to activate all of them except this one. And the Spring Boot supports this kind of scenarios. So how it works? The Spring Boot intelligently loads configuration based on active profiles. So when you activate a profile, all these associated configurations will be applied, and we will see in a moment more details. So in this draw, you can see you have the Spring Boot application, and imagine that you activate a profile like dev, and you imagine that in your application you are providing 4 different application properties. So this is the default one, but you want one with this name here, like dev, one for prod and one for test, or other names. Again, it's not mandatory to use these names. It's the name that you want. You can call it ABC, and that's okay. Spring Boot doesn't care about the name. But when you provide something like this, like dev, Spring Boot automatically understands, okay, I will not load the application properties, but I will load application dev because you're providing dev. Or if you provide more than one, it will load several of them. But there are other ways. For instance, you can create a YAML file and create multiple configurations on the same, but I will explain in a moment how you can do it. Okay, and then after he understands all these configurations, the Spring context where all the beans and configurations exist during the application execution, it will be also filtered by your active profile, meaning that there is a specific annotation that you can put on a bean and say, this bean, it should only be activated for these profiles. Imagine again the example of a message queue that only exists in production. You can say this bean that connects, or use the data source to connect this message queue only when it's in production. And I have an alternative bean that returns the same type, but it's for dev. And maybe it's a mock saying, with a system out saying, okay, the message was sent, something like that. Okay, let's see some details about this. So why use profiles? First, most of the time, and that's true, your dev environment, it's not the same as the production environment, mainly in companies like assurance, banks, and things like that. The databases are different. You can't connect to all the systems, mainly the ones that connect banks with each other. So you would need a way to have the same application, and so when you are in dev, you have a specific set of beans that works and specific data source. But when we go to production, you have a different set of configurations, and you want to do this in the most easy way when you are developing. And profiles, it's the main reason for its existence. Feature toggling, it's the same. Maybe when some features that you are trying dev, they are bad, you don't want to go them to production, so you can mark them using a profile. So this is better. I mean, in this dev environment, I'm including all the beans that belong to this beta development for this specific feature. Of course, you have to find a way to, let's say, design your application where these features are implemented that fit the purpose of the profile. That database switching, as I was saying, it's probably one of the main usages of the Spring Boot profiles. External service integration, like I was saying, it can be APIs, it can be message queues and other systems that you don't have access in development environment. Security settings, imagine that your application works in OpenID, OAuth, single sign-on environments. In dev, it's too much work. Imagine that every time you run your application, you have to go through all the process of this kind of authentications. You just maybe want to disable the authentication, or maybe you just want to use username and password. But when you switch to production, you want the real authentication. That's one way. So you create beans, one specific for the username and password, and the other one for OpenID/OAuth2, for instance. And you just use the profiles to change between each other depending on the environment. And usually when you are in development, probably your logging level, you want to be debug all the time, but when you go to production, probably you want to be at minimum warning. So this is one of the examples. If you are activating a profile like dev name, it will try to find your property files like application dev. There are other ways that there are at least 4 different ways for you to provide the profiles and to load properties, things like that. I will explain in a moment. This is just one of them. So if you choose dev, it will be dev. If it's prod, it will try to find the application and then prod properties. And you can see that, for instance, in dev, we are using a database like H2, which is usually the database that I use if I don't need storage procedures. But in production, probably you're using a Postgres or something. So you want different files, at least for these properties. Okay, how can you define the properties? You can do it in your regular properties or using mel. The most common direct approach, and usually the most understandable, and that's usually when we teach about these things, we start with this application and then the name of profile here, and then you give it a name. So you choose a name here, and when your application starts, you pass an export variable, a parameter. I will explain in a moment all the ways that you can pass the activation of profile, and you will try to find the properties file with this name and with the name of the profile that you need. And you can create as many as you want. So this is a common example. You have application properties. For dev, maybe you want dev, prod, test. But again, it's not only about environments, and I will show in a moment other examples. But inside the application, you have this string, and in the others, probably it's the same, but probably this will change, and this is value change. This should be the same, of course, because the beans expect the same property name. In this case, it's a property name for the Spring and Tomcat, so you don't change this part, but we'll change this port number probably when we switch between these files here. Let's see, for instance, an example for dev will be something like, okay, we have a greeting message, a port like this one, the database will be H2. I want to update every DDL operation, meaning that every time the application starts, if there are changes on the table, recreate them, add columns, and the debug, and the logging should be debug. Of course, in production, you want to disable the DDL. It will be a big serious risk. You want to say, okay, sorry, but don't touch the database automatically. The database, it's a different one. You have a username and password, and usually at least, or you have info or something, and most of the times, it's not even info. Most of the time, it will be something like warning or error. And you can see that most of the properties are the same, but of course, If you're using a different database, probably the requirements for the properties will be the same. So you can always ask, okay, but the properties here are different than this one. But usually the properties that are different, you can see that are related to the same group. It will be something Spring data source. In this case, it's URL, and this doesn't need at least an explicit way to provide username and password. It's optional, but this one requires you a username and password. And that's why you're putting it, meaning that when you use this driver, it will expect to find these properties. But in this case, this driver will not expect unless you say so those properties. So there is no problem. And at the end of the day, it depends on the bins that you are loading when you are in production mode or dev mode here. Okay, remember that inside your application, some of these properties will be in bins that you can also segregate by the Spring profile. There is an alternative way, rather than have multiple files for different multiple files for different profiles. I was messing with my mind. You can, if you use an application-YML, you can put everything on the same file. You create this separator, and here you can see that you choose the profile. So this works as a kind of applications default, like the properties, the application.properties. This one, and you can see here the dev, okay, and these properties will be almost the same as these ones. It will work as same as kind of a application /dev dot properties. Okay, it's not slash, but if and dev dot properties. So all of them set file. Now you have a separator here, and you can add another one for production and so on, and it will be different properties. So you can put everything in just one file. Sometimes people like it more. It's everything, it's in one place. Some people say, okay, but it's not a good thing to send to production, things like that. Yeah, it's always a choice. There is no, you don't expect me to just use this. Sometimes it's a question of taste, a conversation within the team. If you are the architect, maybe you have an opinion about that. If you are the team leader, maybe you want to ask to the architect, or maybe you are the architect and it's enough for your company, and you choose, talk with people and take a decision. It should be clear to everyone. But at the end of the day, just don't put there sensible information for all the environments. It's not a good thing. So how can you mark your bins for specific profiles using the annotation profile, and can be applied to component, service, repository, controller, and configuration class, and even on bin methods. So let's see how it works. So at the end of the day, it is as simple as this. You just put profile, and you are saying that this configuration, all the bins inside this class for this configuration, should only be loaded when the active profile it's ever one of the active profiles. You can have more than one profile active at the same time. And this one is for production. So imagine it's not in the real use case, probably you'll see something like data source here and data source here. So the bin will have the same type, but this one, it's for production. Probably it will have a Postgres data source like we saw previously in configuration, and this one for the H2. By the way, I will show you this example working later on this video in a real application in Spring. Another approach, and it's probably the most popular one and the elegant one, is when you have a service like this or REST controller, any component, and you have an interface. So this class implements this interface, and this will also implement this interface. You are putting different profiles here. So now you don't have to choose using a qualifier or a bin name to distinguish when you want to inject this notification service, for instance, in a controller. The profile will be enough because only one of them will be loaded into memory, unless you say that you want to activate dev and prod at the same time, which will be quite strange. But if it's not the case, you choose dev or prod, only one of these bins will exist, so you won't have any ambiguity on the injection of the controller, because only one will be on the application context of Spring. As I was saying previously, you can do combinations. You can activate more than one, and you can even use Boolean expressions. You can negate, and you can say activate all the profiles except this one. Okay, I'm talking backwards. So when you use this annotation, you are saying that this bin only loads when it's not production. And again, here the bins load. This bin will load when you have dev and test activated, and you can even use the end when both are activated. This works like or, this one works like an and. That's one of the things that you can use. Be careful with that. If you put a lot of them, then it will be really, really difficult to troubleshoot. When your application starts and it says, I cannot find this bin, or this bin is duplicated, things like that. It's something that can happen, and it happens if you are not experienced on bin profiles. Usually if you have dev, test, and prod, it should be okay. But if you go more granular on the profiles, you can start to have this kind of issues. So in the configuration, rather than use at the class level, you can use at the method level, and you can say like this: don't consider this bin, or don't load this bin, or if it's production, okay, you just negate. And this you should consider this bin if dev or qua or QA it's active, and this for integration and CI. You can see that it's not about dev and prod. Sometimes you can have integration components, and probably they are useful. Imagine the example that I explained earlier about connecting in production to message queues. Maybe you want a set of bins that are doing the integration, and they don't make any sense to exist in dev because they will not be used. And maybe the drivers, and when you deploy, you don't have the drivers in the Tomcat and things like that. So sometimes you have more than one profile that only makes sense, for instance, when you are in production or non-production. Methods of activation. Now we saw how we can mark or how we can create property files and mark bins for specific profiles. Now, how do we choose which profiles should be active and how on a Spring Boot application? The first one, it's the system property, and it follows this order. So if you define a specific or activate a specific profile using a system property like this one, when you start your application, this is the name that you give. This profile name, of course, will be this prod integration, things like that. Okay, if you provide this way to activate your Spring profile, then it will have precedence over the environment variable. Okay, and the second one, and this is one way for you to activate using environment variables, will have precedence over the application properties. It means if you have an application properties with dev, but you activated the prod, the application dev will be ignored in parallel of the system properties. So this is the order. If it has already defined it somewhere and there is a conflict, usually the system property gains over the environment over the application properties, and application properties over the programmatic activation. So this is just a way to show you that. So it always from the left to right. The command line has the more precedent, then the environment variable, then the application properties, and then what you write inside the Spring application. These are the four different ways for you to activate, and it can all of them exist at the same time. But every time there is a conflict, this one precedes the other ones, and the second over the others. And if you think for a while, and you want to understand, this is logical, because the command line, it's probably the most, let's say, if you think about distance between, in the process of starting to execute the application, the furthest way, it's the command line. It's where everything starts. So you start your application and you send the command line, I want to do this. Now when the application starts, it will check for environment variables because it's related with the environment. And then after the environment, it will check for what configuration should I apply to this application that it's starting. And after he understands which will be the configurations, then we'll start to run and we'll check on the code if there are profiles to be activated or not. If you think for a while, this is quite logical. This is the most, let's say, external way, and then you start to enter on your application. So it means that every time this Spring application will execute the code, like something like this Spring application set additional profiles, when you want to activate this test, first it will check if it's not already configured by a previous one. And the previous one would be something like the application properties or the application if and something. And this one, it's only applied if it's not yet configured on an environment variable. That makes sense when you are deploying in the cloud and the production environments. And the environment variable will only be considered if it was not explicitly said in the command line which Spring profile should be applied. If you think for a while, this makes sense. It's like you are narrowing the configuration. You are starting from the more abstract way or the most far away place, which is the command line, until you reach the end of the application. And the most far away option, it's always the one that it's more important and precedes all of the others. It has the highest precedence on all the process. So how to, in practice, to activate all these things using application properties or application, you can do it inside like this, Spring Profiles Active Dev. If you are only using application properties, you don't want to create a different ones, you can just put dev like this, so it will be the active profile. If you are using command line, you can use this option like this, Spring Profiles Active Prof, and if you look into this, it's the same. This is just another way to set a property that you can put on the application properties, and you can inject from outside. And this one precedes, again, it's not related with profiles, but usually when you provide a Spring property from in the command line, again, it precedes the one that it's inside the application properties. So now you understand why this makes sense. So the one that you define here or here always precede what's inside here, not only on the profile activation, but even for any property in Spring. If you want to use the Java virtual machine, again, you can use this option, okay? And of course, the environment variables, depends on the operating system. If you are on Linux or Mac OS, for instance, use the export. In Windows, use the set in a Docker file. If you are containerized your application, you want to use the environment Spring Profiles active, and it will be applied to your application unless a more precedent one was already defined. So in a programmatic way, this is the one that was missing on our explanation. It's on the main, of course, Spring application, and in one way is to use the set additional properties, and you write here your profile R, and this is a second way that you can use. It's a different one, but it's using the set active profiles, and you use the profile here. It's a little bit different between two, but usually this one, it's more popular. Okay, of course, when you are applying profiles, there's something that I will, that probably if you start right away, maybe something of your application will fail. Imagine that you have two bins, and in one of the bins you put a profile, say this is the profile for dev, but there is an alternate bin, let's say, that implements the same interface. If you don't provide a reference to a profile to the alternate bin, you will get an error, because Spring will not know what to do with the bin, because he understands when you provide dev, it should be that bin that should be activated, but he doesn't know about the other. When you don't say nothing about any bin, all of them are default bins. But when you start to provide profiles to specific bins, in case of conflict, imagine that you are choosing between two bins, one it's dev and the other one you don't have a profile there, you will have a problem. You should provide even you have to explicitly provide a profile name. And in this case, you can use, for instance, default or not dev or something like that. But Spring will need that. If you try, you can see the error appearing. And I'm advancing you this information because when I start working on this, I start to have these errors. And I thought, okay, if I'm saying that it's dev, why doesn't know about the other bins? Yeah, it doesn't know what to do with them because it stops to understand to which profile that bin belongs. And you have to provide one, even if it's the default. If you don't use profiles, by default there is one, which is the default. But if you start to add more profiles and set profiles, in case of ambiguity, you have to provide another for the alternate bin or alternate bins a name, even it can be default to those bins. Otherwise, you'll start to have problems when your application starts. It's just a tip that that I'm advanced to you to avoid you some nightmares or some headaches that I had because I didn't understand the logic, but that's the way it works. So you should to write something like profile default, just to compensate if there is another bin that it's an alternative to this one default rating that it's marked, for instance, for dev or prod or whatever. Otherwise, you will have problems. So you can also activate multiple profiles simultaneously by separate with a comma, like this, dev and show. As I said previously, you are not required to choose one. You can combine them, but be careful with the granularity, because it can really start to be messy, because Spring Boot is a great tool, but it follows the paradigm of declarative approach. So you declare your intentions about how your application should be designed and started. And you have the profile beans, you have the beans, the beans that depends on each other, what are the scope of the beans. But all of this behavior, it's declared. You don't push it anywhere in the code. You don't say, now you do this and now you do that. You just have the main, you have annotations, and that's it. If you complicate too much and you have too much granularity, unless you are really experienced and you know what you're doing, if you have dozens of beans, it can start to be really, really difficult when something fails you. When you start to have these errors about ambiguity and conflict, at some point you'll start to use something like dependencies between the beans to resolve ambiguities, or using the annotation order. Okay, start this one, it will override the other one. You can start using annotations like lazy, and it's a bad sign, probably because you are using too much granularity on your definitions. So be careful with that. I don't know if it's a good idea to have a profile like H2. Sometimes I like to write these things that are that they seem wrong, just to highlight that probably it's not a good idea. So you are in dev, probably it's implicitly that you want to choose H2, unless you say, no, in dev we have two different databases. We have an H2 and we have SQLite or a MySQL. So that's why when I activate the dev, also I want to choose which database I want to use. Great, that's a good use case. But if it's only one, it doesn't make any sense to put a specific profile to H2. The dev already includes the beans, the data source to target H2. That's a different. It's when you have options, and options that are documented, are decided in the team, are options that, okay, make sense, okay, are more than one, okay, create the profile to distinguish between them. But if it's not the case, probably if you say the relation, it's always one-to-one. When I'm in dev, this is the message queue, this is the database, this is this folder on the file system, put everything on the same profile. Don't split too much the profiles, otherwise it will be really crazy to troubleshoot all of things. So this is another example where you activate prod and metrics. Metrics make sense because you have probably, you want to activate some kind of observability that you don't want to use in dev, but you want in prod, or maybe even on testing on quality environments, but they don't make sense on dev. So when you activate in specific environments, you say, okay, in prod, I want to activate metrics. But the metrics are here, it's not because of the prod. Again, because it's the same problem that I explained with dev and H2. They are here because sometimes you want to disable the metrics, but you are still in prod. Okay, so that's one option. But in this case, H2, if it's only database in dev, there is no need to create a profile called H2. But in this case, makes sense because sometimes you just want to disable. And one of the use cases that we talked before, it's sometimes we use profiles to kind of feature toggles or feature flags. I want to disable this feature in a specific environment. So I set the profile of the beans related with metrics with this profile, and sometimes I activate, and sometimes I just disable and I don't activate. So my application starts, but I don't want to include observability or metrics. And the same applies here in test and Kafka enable. Sometimes I want to do tests without Kafka, and sometimes I want to do tests with Kafka. So in this case, it makes sense to have more than one profile. Okay, I was clear about this, but I think it's one of the most important concepts and the best advice that I can give you about the profiles. So when multiple profiles are active, properties from the default profile are loaded first, meaning which are all the beans that are not marked with the profile. Then properties from the explicit active profiles are loaded in the order they are specified. Meaning in this case it will be dev and then H2, in this case prod and then metrics, and so on. If a property exists in multiple active profiles, the last one loaded according to the activation will proceed. It's not about the name of the profile, which has a different order. But for the properties or beans that belong to specific profiles, that's the rule. So it's the latest one that will wins. Beans annotated with any of the profiles will be loaded. So another thing that it exists, because sometimes you need to go with all that granularity and you want to create profiles to build a kind of a stacks of your application. Imagine that you have H2, web components, mock APIs, and things like that. So you can create, for instance, say, okay, I want to create a group, call it dev local for profiles, and it will include H2, web, mock API. And you can do combination. It's quite nice because you can put real APIs, you can activate the mock APIs, you can have this database or change to another database, and you call it dev local. And then rather than activating these three profiles, you just do Spring Profiles active and you put the name that you write here as the group name, and it will activate automatically all the beans and properties related with these profiles. The same applies for the command line. It's the same property. And this is just a visual way to explain what we were saying. So you have the Spring Profiles active dev local. So it will combine all the configurations, load all the beans, and it will activate H2, the web, and mock API in this order, the profiles, like if they were split and not in a group. Because at the end of the day, there are still three profiles, but we just give a nice name for us to simplify, let's say, the management and the configuration. Best practice, define a default configuration. Always have accessible defaults in application properties, because by default, that's the default active profile. But sometimes you have to write the default property on the beans. Use meaningful names like dev, test, prod, user acceptance testing, local, and things like that, cloud, because people understand what kind of configurations and what kind of beans probably will be included on these profiles. If you are using secrets, never put them inside properties or any place. Usually the best approach is to use environment variables, or if you have access, use a vault or even Spring Cloud config for production secrets. Never put them right. Sometimes people put it and say, later I will remove it. Yeah, that will never happen. You will forget it. I ask you, what have you wrote 2 weeks ago on Thursday afternoon? Unless something important happened, probably you don't understand. You don't remember which code or which decision you will took. You just write, or you just wrote stuff about it for some feature, but you don't remember what was the name of the variable and things like that, unless you work really, really slow and you just write a few codes a week and you remember completely. I hope not. That's not the case, unless you are writing code that is really sensible, like health industry and things like that. Prioritize external activations. It's better to do external because it is easy to change environments without touching your application. That's why most of the deployments use environment variables or configuration files that are outside. Sometimes in my applications, I even use a configuration server that is outside the application. And when the application starts, it goes to the configuration server and asks for the configuration. Of course, in dev, maybe it's not a good way, but when it goes to production, I favor these kind of scenarios. And small focus profiles. When you think about the profile, say, okay, if I start this profile, does it have any dependence with other profiles? If it has, okay, reanalyze it. If it doesn't, okay, maybe it's a good profile. And always ask, it's something that if I switch off, my application still starts. If it doesn't start, maybe you should merge this profile with a different one. Avoid overusing profile. Yeah, use as less as you can. It can be a really nightmare if you have dozens or hundreds of beans. I think it's very easy to imagine the situation, and this is quite tricky. That's one of the costs that you have if you start to have a lot of profiles. You have to test all the combinations. Otherwise, how do you know, or at least the combinations that you think we'll use in dev, in test, and in production. And if you provide this documentation for the DevOps team and things like that, you say you can use these, and these profiles. So do we have this? It's only these 3 profiles. But if you think for a while, unless you explicitly say which ones, when you have 3, you have at least 3 + 2, 6 different combinations of profiles. Okay, so You have with 1, with 2, with 3, maybe 4. I'm doing the math wrong. We have 1, 2, 3. Yeah, the combination, at least 4, you have to test it. Okay, when you have 1, when you have 2, when you have 3, and now you have the combinations of the other ones. Yeah, between 4 and 6. I'm not doing the math now, but it's something like that. I think you understand what I'm saying. So conclusion, flexibility. That's one of the great things about the profiles. Maintainability. You centralize and manage environment-specific configurations in separate, clear locations because you have specific files for properties and specific beans with specific purpose, which is good, but be careful, plan ahead what these property files mean and what are the implications with the beans. So segregate them well in your application, have a purpose for them, maybe organize it some way, an easy way to find them, maybe different packages or something like that. It's not an easy task, but imagine if you have integration, maybe you have a package in the service, it's called integration and things like that. I will say something like this in the repository. If you have different databases and they have some difference between them, you can put just a package called data or repositories, or maybe repositories H2 and repositories another database, or default, something like that. I'm not saying it's the best approach, but I am thinking try to group them inside your application to make your life easier when you have to troubleshoot and find quite easily where are the beans that can be segregated from other beans. Don't forget to test everything, and it's a challenge when you have multiple profiles. And of course, readability, keep your main code base cleaner by externalizing configuration concerns. When you put too much annotations and configuration inside the application, it can be really difficult to find them. And I know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I do some code review, and sometimes these people, they swear that they really have great configuration and they follow the clean code, everything is great, but sometimes it's very difficult for me to find where are the configuration files. I expect to have a package called configuration something, but it's not. It's okay, I put the configuration for services close to the services and the other ones in another place, okay, but I didn't know unless it is documented. So Spring Boot profiles are an indispensable tool for building robust, adaptable, and production-ready applications. By understanding and effectively utilize them, you gain immense control over your application's lifecycle across different stages. That's the selling point, but there are a lot of challenges that I highlighted during the presentation, and I really hope that you listen to all of them because they will be important when you start to use this feature of Spring Boot. So now I will present you a real example. It will be a simple one, but it will be enough for you to understand how easy it is to implement this. I did a really simple example, and I'm sure that you will understand how easy and how great it can be. Okay, this is the application that I'm following on all these videos about Spring. And what I did was just to create a configuration H2 database that is being following in all the examples that I'm creating for Spring. And I'm saying that if we are not in a quality environment, it should be database. I'm using quality and not quality. Of course, probably it will be something like not production and not quality or something like that. But let's say that I just want to target my application for quality. So this is the bin that I have here, which contains the data source. And an alternative way, this exists because one of the lessons that I explained earlier about naming bins, and I created this one. But this is the bin that returns a data source, and there is a JDBC template. All of this, it's inside this configuration that it's only applied when it's not quality, and it will be the data source, the JDBC template, and name parameter JDBC template. And you can guess that every DAO or every repository class that I have needs at least a JDBC template, and JDBC template needs a data source. So I should have an alternative way to the H2, and the alternative way is to use a MySQL. And I'm using the MySQL using something that's called test containers that I explained in a previous video, which is it's a technology, check my previous video, I'll not explain everything here, but what I'm saying is that, okay, I want to start a MySQL database server using a container, so you should have Docker installed, and and when I activate the profile class. So when I'm the test environment, quality environment, I want to use a MySQL. But when I'm not in the quality environment, that I'm in dev, I want to use the H2. So these beans, they only be loaded depending on the profile. And you can see that you have a data source here. You have the JDBC template and named parameter. And of course, here I have the data source. But now for MySQL, the JDBC template, and this is a transaction manager, because when we start to use this kind of robust databases, it's a good practice to create a transaction manager. So let's see this working. So the first thing, we have to choose a profile. And here in IntelliJ, you can do any of the ways that I provided you during the presentation. In this case, I will just, IntelliJ is quite clever and say, okay, maybe you want to use a profile. So I will use here the quality environment. It will set this as a common parameter for the application. I will do that, and I will start my application. It was already starting, but I started again. And let's see the output. And you can see it's going to Docker because I have MySQL installed here, and it's using the test containers, which is this because of this class here. Okay, and if we follow this trace here, the log, at some point, it will create a connection to the MySQL that you can see here. And this is everything, it's automated. This is the only code, and again, you can check out my code on the GitHub. And I think it was my previous lesson with story procedure, where I explain in detail about the test containers. I will create a further video when I address the testing in Spring Boot, where I'll go more deep on these test containers. But for now, my previous license was good enough for you to understand and apply it in your project. So it created a MySQL, listened on this port, okay, and created this database. And this is because of this. It's a MySQL version 8 finds database with this username and this person, but the rest, it's the same. I only need this configuration, and if you look into the POM, you will see the dependencies that you have to use. So now here I have to go to the properties. Here, this is always changing. Now the port is this one because it generates a new port every time. I will test the connection. I hope it works, succeed, meaning that this application, the database, it's online. And I hope to see the tables here. These tables, by the way, are created because of these files that I have here, the data and schema, and I have an initializer here if you want to follow my code, where I load these files and ask to be executed to the database that it's in memory. In this case, it will be for the, because in this case, it was not necessary. The Spring Boot has done this everything automatically, but if you want to make sure that it works, you just uncomment this. That's why I comment. But if you think it's not running, you can always execute it like this. But it was not necessary here, so I will just, but I can activate, so it will be like this in the code. It still works. I think, let's try. I think it will override just to make sure that it works also like this. So I'm started again. So it will create a new test container in a different port. Now it's this one. Okay. Probably now it's creating database, starting Docker, and target this, executing the scripts. Yep. Now you have an error because it already exists, and that's why I comment the line. It's not necessary. That's the way I configure the application and Spring Boot when it detects the data and the schema files it executes on the current database. Okay, so that was the reason I commented. Okay, but if you need to initialize with additional SQL, you can put the files that you want here and initialize. It's a good script that you can use and you can find again on the GitHub. So the application, it's here. Again, let's start it because it failed now. And you can see that this is the only database that was initialized. It's the MySQL, which is here. Container is started. JDBC connected to it. This is the address of MySQL, and the application started here. Now, if I execute some HTTP entities, for instance, get all the entities that goes to database. If you are following my videos, You know, this is an API that is calling a service, which is a repository here. You can see on the repositories here, and is getting the data from database and is going to this MySQL. Now let's stop and say, okay, no, I don't want, I want the other bin, not quality. Or maybe I want to remove it, but just let's remove it. It's not mandatory. So we expect now the H2 to start. And now you can see now it's the H2 database, and the application already started because this is in my memory database. And you can see the database, it's here. You don't see the MySQL anymore because the bin was just ignored. And the data source is now using the H2, meaning that if I execute this, get to database, it returns the same data, but it's going to a different database. And where is it, this database? It's the H2 that you can usually access on your address of your application. In our case, it's this localhost finances, and you provide this H2 console. Where do you get this name? If it's the first time that you are seeing this, it should be here on the output. You can see here that you can use the address of your application on this path to get here. And now you provide here the address that you can see here on the right. Usually the username and password is SCA and empty. You test the connection. I hope it's working. Let's connect, and you can see here the entities. Of course, the interface is not as nice as IntelliJ, but if I run this, you can see here the data. Okay. So this is what I wanted to show you about the profiles. It's quite easy. We just this profile here and saying explicitly here that this should be applied when it's not quality. And remember that I don't need to provide this. I just didn't provide the quality here. Since I didn't provide, this is true, so this bin was loaded. But since this is true, this is false because I didn't provide this one. So it loaded the H2 in memory. And that's how bin profiles work. This is a very easy example. When you have multiple bins, it starts to be a little bit messy, but it can be a really good tool that you can use when you have different external systems in different environments. And sometimes it's difficult to create a really good dev environment, a really good test environment, and a really good production environment regarding bins and configurations for your application. So I hope you learned something with this video. I hope you like it. Please subscribe my channel, share it with your friends, provide like. Be free to comment, send even requests. Sometimes people ask me to present some things, and I do when I have time. And please keep liking, keep subscribing, because it motivates me to create additional videos. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next videos.